So to everyone here already, thank you for joining. So I'm Laura, Associate Experience Design Director at Fierce. So essentially I look after the experience design discipline. I'm really excited for this event around design research and to be joined by the panel that we've got today. I'm going to hand over to them for some quick introductions, but before I do, just a few things for me to run through. So firstly, please we've started already, but please continue to use the chat as we go along. Tell us where you're coming from, share your thoughts, your reactions, your views, but also your questions. We're going to ensure that we have time at the end to kind of cover off anything that comes through and get through as much as we can as well. Other things to cover, we are recording just so that everyone is aware of that, and the captions should be available and showing, and we're going to share the recording probably within the next couple of weeks. It looks like it's working. Everyone should be on mute automatically, but please stay on mute as well for the sake of the recording also, unless you want to come off at the end and ask a question. And I think that's everything. So let's go. I'll ask the panel to just introduce themselves quickly. Maybe I can kick it to you, Tom, to start us off.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Tom White, and I'm the Director of Design Research at Zencargo. Zencargo is a digital freight forwarder. So we're a Series B startup dealing in international trade. And our product design team work on the digital offering and digital platform that our user base use. So that's manufacturers, our customers, our operations teams, amongst a few. I've been here for about 2.5 years. It's my first in-house role, actually. Looking to move from consulting. I was working for a small consultancy where we helped sort of a range of different businesses and size of business, but predominantly larger business with innovation strategies. And we did that by sort of embedding with them, building digital products, taking them to market and having built a team around that so they could sort of understand how digital products were built and taken to market, and also how they could compete with some of the startup market. So I've got sort of slightly different background there, and moving has been an interesting move. I guess why that was useful at that stage in terms of research is that research was kind of one of the fundamental principles and disciplines that we sort of helped teach through that process to get buy-in for really solid product development. So yeah, maybe that's a bit about me. Lorna, do you want to have a jump in?
Great. Hi, everybody. So Lorna Ross, and I am currently the Chief Innovation Officer for a large payer provider here in Ireland. It's a healthcare provider and also an insurer. So we have about 1/4 of the population, and it's a kind of semi-state organization. And we're doing a kind of large kind of transformation of the kind of Irish healthcare system. And prior to that, I worked with Accenture for a period of time. I ran the Fjord Design Studio inside their Global Innovation Center, also here in Dublin, which was called a DOC. And so it was a really interesting kind of R&D, is an interesting R&D kind of environment around emerging tech. And so we were kind of bringing the discipline of design into the kind of R&D context. Prior to that, at Mayo Clinic for about 9 years, running the design studio at the Centre for Innovation, so very patient-centric. So I guess without going through the kind of litany of, I've worked in the kind of, I guess, the area of kind of human-centered innovation. So it's a little bit of kind of, innovation through design, but also through the lens of the kind of human, and a lot in kind of tech environments. Mike, sorry, pass it to you. Excuse me.
No worries. Hi everyone, I'm Mike Blacker. So I joined Zencargo in early 2021. I was the first dedicated researcher in the team, and working with Tom, we sort of cemented the value of research at Zencargo. So now I lead a growing team of researchers. I started my career in UX design and research for some of the big charities. So originally Doctors Without Borders, and then I moved to cancer research, where I was working in the innovation team, sort of coaching other teams across the business and how to approach projects in a lean and agile way and apply research in that context. And then I moved into the startup space. So my last role was in an ag tech startup before I moved to Zencargo.
Awesome, thank you. So let's kind of start off quite broadly and then we'll kind of dive in. So I'm kind of here to talk about C-suite buy-in research, but buy-in, it feels like a subject that we speak about a lot in the design world, getting that seat at the table, having a voice, and maybe it's not necessarily something you hear on neighboring disciplines kind of shouting about as much. So I'd love to get your views to kind of start with your experience on why you think this is happening, if you do, and what you think design can, like what we need to start thinking about in order to influence change. Lorna, maybe I can start with you.
Sure. It's funny because I just had this like flashback of a moment where I think maybe it was for me, I was trying to quickly tell this story. So I was about maybe not even a year into running the design studio at Mayo. And I had come, I have prior to that about 20 years working in the kind of design research and R&D space, and was probably pretty daunted about kind of coming into Mayo Clinic, which is very evidence-based and it's a really scientific community. And so thinking about bringing a discipline like design into the clinical practice and credentialing it and how to figure out how it would kind of stack up against very much the kind of science and evidence-based communities in terms of how decisions are made. And I remember being in a meeting, and there was a clinician who we were kind of, pushing. We were kind of exploring a little bit about kind of design and what we needed to do from a design perspective in terms of research and understanding patient need. And I think at the time I was really, really kind of determined for people to understand design. And I kept talking about our process. And after this meeting, he called me aside and he said, if you continue to do that, you're running the risk of becoming irrelevant. And what he was saying was that, if you can't figure out a way to bring design to the table where it's compatible with what we do here, and that it's not exclusive, and that it's not something that we have to learn about, but that you can kind of find this common ground and it can be translated into something that is meaningful within this community, within the context of healthcare, then what would happen is that you will just be irrelevant here. And I remember really, he walked away down a corridor, and I remember probably it was one of the most humbling experiences because I was running a design group, and there's probably nothing worse than being irrelevant. It's worse than being redundant, is that people just ignore you. And so I think I consider that a real gift, is that he was basically, kind of reflecting to me that I was being so maybe precocious or arrogant about the discipline of design, and insisting that people respect it, and insisting that we could preserve it, versus understanding how to kind of disassemble it and reassemble it and make it relevant in a clinical context. And so I made it my kind of focus to think about understanding the context of an environment that is very evidence-based and is based on the kind of principles of science, and what is understood to be true is based on a lot of rigor and a process. And that was the currency, that was basically the kind of social currency in that organization. And so I really had to go back to basics and rethink the design principles in the context of a scientific community. And I think an awful lot of our success, that led from that, working within Mayo Clinic, was really thinking about the context of what do we have to do as a design discipline to not preserve the kind of, I guess there's this whole kind of sense of the kind of purity of design, but it's really thinking about how it is applied into different environments. And so I think for me, it's always been, spending time understanding context and understanding the environment that you're coming into, or the community or the culture that you're coming into, and really adapting. Like, design is very, very adaptive. I think it's what we do very well, but it's adapting it into it and understanding how it starts to drive value in different places, versus coming in with an idea of design and defending it. You can put an awful lot of energy into defending design and trying to educate people into understanding it, when I think the energy should be put into adapting to design, into being influential, and into having deep credentials, irrespective of what industry you're in.
I was sort of, just to build on that slightly, Lorna, I think that was where I was going to go slightly with this, in terms of the value and why it's important to get buy-in. I kind of loathe subjectivity in the design process, and how difficult that can become, particularly when you're looking at sort of, I guess, smaller CEO-led companies, let's say. where one person's decision really rules over others. And I think the idea of sort of having some tools in your armory that can allow you to step away from that subjectivity is really what's important. And that's why I think, that's why I value research so much, is that you can take an evidence-led approach and you can point to specific evidence or things that you found out that helps drive those decisions and take it away from being me versus you and why my decision is best. I think if I'm honest, I feel like there's a lot of arrogance in the design world where you think your ideas are the best, and in reality, I rarely think that's necessarily the case. Whereas I think research can help back up why decisions are obviously the right ones to be taking. But we had a really good conversation yesterday, very, very briefly, on some of the points you're talking about there, being adaptive to the audience and knowing. I think that's the challenge that we're probably going to be talking a little bit about today, is knowing the audience that you are, in terms of sort of the C-suite or the stakeholders that you have in the business, and knowing what's, talking the same language so that you can actually understand what to play back to them and what's going to really resonate with them to help them understand the value of research. Mike, I don't know if you've got anything to add or.
I think you've elaborated quite well. I think talking the language of the leadership team is like really important. So talking about design and on research in general, it's like mitigating risk is really valuable. Like risk, efficiency savings, and bringing in additional income. If we can tie what we're doing back to those points, like it has a much more likely chance of resonating with the leadership team and things. So when I go into like a business, it's kind of making sure we understand the needs of the business and then playing back research that we're doing through that lens and helping, like working with teams to make sure that we're sort of targeting like the right questions to ask for that are relevant to them. Those sort of things, just like showing, like not telling, is like the most valuable option.
Yeah. I love that showing rather than telling, because I think sometimes, and we spoke about it in terms of the terminology that we use, but the word kind of buy-in, it feels like sometimes it has to be that sales push. I think Lorna, you mentioned it there. We're really we're educating, we're going in hard. We've got, here's our idea, and we're going to try and force it on you. And sometimes it's more about kind of taking a step back, pivoting the language, and maybe even thinking about it more as let's kind of co-create something with you, in the same way that as a designer you'd kind of look to your stakeholder, and rather than just kind of put, here's my final design, you're going to take this now. It's more about kind of going and understanding their needs and kind of working with them to kind of find the right solution. I think we touched on it when we spoke around the language that we used around, this isn't what we do, but it's kind of what we achieve, and it's like our outcomes rather than our methodology. And I wonder if anyone wants to kind of elaborate on that point a bit more. I think that's kind of an interesting one.
I think when we were chatting yesterday, and certainly my experience is that, I think design is, potentially design is, people choose it as a career, and it can feel quite linked to, it can feel like a bit of a vocation. And because of that, it can feel quite personal. And so I think as a designer, there's a kind of overlap. Creativity is very personal, and it's maybe different. I don't want to say it's different. I think anyone who has a passion for their career, so I don't think we should be exclusive and say it's different. But, if it is a passion, and if it's passion driven, and if it is a vocation, you can take things really personally. You can over personalize it. And I think that can get in the way of doing your work. And I think, the kind of the nature of how we are interlopers in other industries. And so designers typically, we kind of more and more are being hired into, we're not being hired into design firms, we're being hired into tech firms. And I've worked healthcare, and we're in different sectors and startup. And so we are a little bit of a kind of interloper in other people's industries. And I think we have a kind of it's an identity crisis, or an anxiety about proving, or, kind of, again, credentialing in that space. And we're often hired in small numbers, so we're often really outnumbered. So you can often be like, I've worked in engineering groups, there's 2 designers and a couple hundred engineers. So we've had that experience of being kind of outnumbered as well. But that's kind of the history. And I think we tend to index heavily into also design as a spectator sport. Like since design became bought into all the consulting firms, it's a bit of a spectator sport. It's used for clients for, you know, buy-in. I mean, I'm sure Tom and Mike, you've seen this all the time. I mean, workshops that's all just, you know, engagement with stakeholders. It's actually not real design. And so we've been kind of rolled out as kind of, you know, entertainment almost. I see it as innovation entertainment. You know, I've run design studios where the designers are busy entertaining clients with post-it notes in, you know, and expensive muffins and stuff. And it's not real design. And it's so frustrating for them because it's like parts of the design process made really conspicuous, and it is a spectator sport, and it's felt like it's a disrespect to the process of design. So I think design's been disassembled in consulting and sold back to clients in a kind of ad hoc way as the people talk about innovation tourism as well. People go around. And so I think there's some stuff we have to acknowledge is happening in design. And so we need to kind of get over it. But that is a lived experience, is that our process has been kind of taken apart ad hoc and sold back to people. And we can't hang on to its coherency. And all the kind of objects and artifacts that we make as part of our process have become part of this kind of currency, like, you know, this big, you know, story, you know, journey maps and stuff plotted and hung on walls and stuff. And so sometimes these artifacts that are part of our process have become something a bit too conspicuous. So I think there is this kind of, we're at a kind of an inflection point where design has become so commoditized as a kind of activity, and it's so overexposed that we kind of need to kind of regroup and to think about, you know, we are having a bit of an identity crisis, and there's a kind of an anxiety, and because the anxiety has been driving this sense of needing to defend what we do. And I think it is more about kind of maturing through that and kind of letting go of some stuff rather than being defensive, like rather than trying to kind of, you know, preserve these kind of traditions of design, is like kind of, you know, let them go and just evolve. I think there's a real evolutionary step that we have an opportunity to take, you know, if we need to or if we wish to.
I think that, oh, sorry, Mike, go on, you go first.
I think yeah, it's a good point about, you know, when often you're the sort of first person in, or like, you know, the team is a lot smaller than teams around you. So meeting people where they're at, and you know, yeah, being flexible in how you approach things is important. As well, you know, it makes that you can't, you know, be the most rigorous researcher out there if you're trying to support so many teams, things like that. So it's I think you're right. I think some of our processes we kind of have to let go in some ways and give ownership to the teams that are working on them. I think that's important for us to be able to scale what we're trying to do in a business.
On the point there about consulting, this isn't kind of because I'm coming from this background at all, but I do think there's something interesting in that. To me, like what you're looking to do there, though, and I think this kind of whole idea around buy-in is really about helping people empathize with the process to then be able to understand the value of it. So I can certainly see where you're coming from, like undervaluing parts of the process, and I think there is a huge risk with that. But to me, when one of the biggest things that I thought was important about the process of initially involving stakeholders and people into design thinking and design processes was the research aspect of that. So what we typically would do was, you know, bring stakeholders and senior stakeholders in particular into that process, putting them, you know, in front of users to actually hear feedback. And it was those sort of interactions they've had, and a light bulb moment. You could actually see it almost in their eyes when one of their assumptions or ideas was disproved, or something that was really poignant stood out to them, and they suddenly realized the value of asking people rather than assuming. And I think there's something really, really powerful in that. The challenge, I think, after that point was reminding people that there was not just one user that we spoke to, but there's a lot of people that we spoke to, and actually have to synthesize the results, because actually it can be a bit of a double-edged sword there in some ways. But to me, that was the power of sort of show, don't tell, is make sure you get something in front, get people in front of other people to sort of disprove their initial assumptions about a process and where it's value. And to Mike's point about kind of mitigating risk, one of the first things that I spoke to our CEO about, I feel kind of in a slightly luxurious position where we're very well bought into research as an organization. But one of the first things we talked about was not necessarily about risk mitigation, but was about research as a cost-saving exercise, not as a cost sink. I think people's initial assumption, I'm sure there's a ton of people on the call who've experienced things in the past where research has been cut or budgets have been cut from that because it's seen as a luxury. And the reality is that, what's going to be worse, doing a little bit more upfront research and trying to understand the space a bit more and make make better calls in the direction you're moving in, or put an engineering team of 7, however big, on something in the wrong direction for 6 months. That it seems like those sort of trying to thread that sort of narrative and understanding to why research is valuable is an important kind of initial step. Again, it comes back to speaking the same language. The CEO is worried about making sure there's money in the business. So that's kind of the language that we sort of took with that.
Cool. I think we've spoken a lot around the idea of research to kind of validate or kind of prove or disprove things and help with our assumptions. I think there's another side of research that sometimes kind of gets missed, and it's almost the kind of, I don't want to say the more powerful side, but definitely just as powerful, which is that kind of exploratory, like new ideas, new innovation that isn't just around maybe more like usability testing, but is more kind of broader research around kind of what is our like proposition, how people, before we even kind of get to a product. And I wonder whether we could just kind of touch on, do you think that buy-in is kind of, I'm trying to think, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Is it more difficult sometimes to kind of get a bit more buy-in for that kind of research rather than the usability, which sometimes feels it can be a bit more kind of tangible for people, that it's easier to kind of see the outcomes or easier to do kind of shorter bursts of that?
In my experience, yeah, I think that like strategic research is a lot harder to get buy-in for initially, especially like, if you're new to a team and there are 4 teams that are working on features that are getting released quite soon, and like you can have a quicker impact, helping them with usability testing and making sure that like the solution is in the right place, so that sort of impact is more tangible to the business. So I think like, when I started, I was doing a lot more of that kind of tactical user research. But we always had a plan that we'd be do much more of the strategic stuff. And Tom and I were constantly paying back to the C-suite that that's the direction we wanted to move. We wanted to move upstream and sort of democratize a lot of the tactical research to our teams, so that they could pick up a lot of that, because it's those teams making those changes as well. So like to see and hear those things firsthand, they can turn those things around a lot more quickly into a good feature. But yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. The strategic, in my experience, is harder to get buy-in for sure.
I wonder, like, to me, I'm thinking about 2 things with this. One is that probably, yes, it is more difficult because I suspect because people can feel like they can be part of that idea generation process, or ideas are kind of slightly more cemented in people's heads. Like, no, this is a good idea. I've come up with this, or a team of people come up with this. It's logical. It kind of makes sense. Let's get into building something and making something, because people want to kind of move to a solution very quickly. So I think there's probably an aspect of that. But I think it's slightly harder to test those sort of propositions. I think that if you're testing a thing that you have the thing to test. Whereas if you're testing an idea, you have to think about what is the right way of testing that? What tools or methodologies can I use? How do I visualize those ideas? And I think that is also a complicated design challenge, is to figure out what is the best way to actually start exploring whether this is the right opportunity, whether this is the right space to be moving into. And I think that's the design process, which is coming up with something completely from scratch, which I think is probably a big frightening space as well for a lot of people. They don't have the skills to do that. Whereas if something's made, you are just testing the thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think speculative. I mean, the kind of the speculation design that speculates, I guess, which is more future facing is, I mean, Tom, to your point, it's like, it's the kind of what if, you know, and I think it becomes a bit like fiction. And it's, you know, I think also, you know, it's probably a really good way of examining, you know, if all, you know, if let's say it's saying if trends and kind of behaviors head in this direction, there's a likelihood that, you know, people are going to start to turn up and have a certain kind of appetite for something or need, or they're going to, you know, kind of, and so you're speculating the kind of direction of travel that an industry or a market is going to go in, or a user's appetite for something. But I think everyone knows that, you know, speculation, you know, 6 months out, it just drops off a cliff because there's so much that's unknown. I think it's really, really hard for people to invest in long term. I think they're really struggling to invest in long term kind of strategies. And sometimes the best way to future proof your organization is to really use design to examine yourselves, like, you know, how fit for purpose. And I think sometimes people turn the design research internally and they look at their own organization, they look at the kind of, you know, capabilities. And we've done that a lot. Is, you know, I'll use healthcare as an example. I mean, you can look at healthcare as an ecosystem, and without knowing what's going to happen, you can start to look at some of the collisions or some of the redundancies that are turning up. And so you look at some of the disruptors. And so there's almost like a kind of process of thinking about all the factors that potentially are going to turn up and shape the future of healthcare. And you can't get it all right, but you can start to kind of identify key elements. And by kind of creating that kind of ecosystem map and thinking about, well, there's tech disruptors and there's behavioral and there's economic disruptors and there's political disruptors, all the different determinants, you can start to think, what's the opportunity, but also where's the risk? I think to Mike's point is you start to see some hotspots, you start to see some stuff emerging that is potentially collisions. And you're thinking, is that a collision an opportunity? Like, is there going to be a new market there? Or is that collision a huge risk? And so you're almost just using these to kind of create a bit of a map and say, you know, in the future, if, you know, the likelihood is there's going to be these kind of moments, and we either want to mobilize around that and colonize that space and be first into that space, or we want to really move away from that space because there's huge redundancies coming. Like, there's a lot happening in healthcare right now that's becoming really redundant, and everyone's taking their hands off it. So no one's investing. So sometimes design is very good diagnostically at building that picture and pointing to things. And it's not about giving you the answer, it's about giving you a bit of a map. And I think sometimes design is underestimated. I mean, I would turn a lot of design, you know, capabilities internally on doing that kind of stuff if you're thinking strategy.
Funnily enough, that's sort of one of the conversations that Mike and I are starting to have with our director of strategy is about bringing design and research into that non-existing team at the moment, but creating a team around that to start informing early stage strategy and direction setting, not necessarily to think up everything early on and have, you know, ideas fed through to teams so they don't have to think about what to do, but really to use design and visualizing of ideas to help explore, and of course research, to help them explore strategy and direction and bring that to life a little bit more, or to interrogate things in a bit more depth rather than sort of kind of lofty strategic thinking.
Well, that's interesting. To that point, I guess the question around, you're talking about almost like creating a new team, research, strategy. Question, I suppose, around where research actually sits organizationally. Like, do they sit kind of with strategy, with marketing? Are they kind of a central discipline, part of innovation R&D? Kind of, with your experience, have you seen, my assumption is that it's kind of quite context dependent on your organization and probably other factors as well, but have you seen anywhere where you can say this is kind of where design is embedded to kind of get the best advantage, or research, we kind of position them in this way to really kind of make the most of what they can offer?
I personally don't think research should be a separate group. You know, I mean, it's a little bit like the kind of conversation about innovation. I mean, do you have an innovation team, or do you try and drive, you know, an innovation mindset throughout your organization? And I don't think you should have a separate research group. I think there's, and I think that's historically maybe what's happened, in that people would kind of bring a group in and they would ask them to do research around understanding customer, understanding unmet need or something, and it would be linked to product development. But you know, maybe it's more ethnography. And so there used to be that kind of, those skills were kind of a little bit, you know, unusual or unique, and so they would be a separate team. And I feel like that's a 30-year-old model, and I would say that, you know, research is just part of a general kind of development process. I mean, any organization that is really kind of committed to understanding their customer and their market has already kind of embedded principles of, you know, being kind of, I guess people talk about being curious about your customer, like, you know, really kind of studying them and understanding what motivates them. And I don't think research should be a separate, I mean, I would be really surprised to find an organization where it has a separate research department, unless they're really academic. Like, I mean, and even then, I think there's it's a whole different conversation around academic research.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, most of what we do is a team sport, right? There's a lot of collaboration that's required through a product development process or in any part of the business. So the experienced teams that we have, but we try to embed, and Mike talks this, I'm sure, a bit more, but like we try to embed for longer periods of time with teams, so that teams have that understanding of the research that they're involved, so they're asking questions, so they carry the nuance of the research that's been conducted throughout the work that they do. I think that's so important. Like the idea of somebody handing off a report, whilst I think there's probably a space for reports and writing up the research that you've done, to me, any sort of handoff point in the process feels like a weakened point where something can go wrong. And I think the same for, you know, the way that our team is hoping to expand a bit more is beyond the software aspect or part of our business into all aspects of the business. I mean, research confined to tech just seems kind of moronic, really. You know, it can help influence the direction of everything. Everyone in the business needs some sort of research at some point. So the idea would be that we would look to embed in different parts of the business. You can see Mike doing that with parts of our customer success team and all of our other researchers sort of picking up different threads throughout the business to help, you know, again, sort of back to building influence. But we know that the value of research really is moving further upstream. The further we move upstream, the earlier on our decisions are evidence driven, the higher likelihood of success further down the line. So that's kind of the strategy that we have, is that we start to broaden our influence and people's understanding of the value of research beyond software. So yeah, I completely agree.
It's even more important in our business because we're like a software and a service. It's a freight forwarder, digital freight forwarder, but kind of a service enabled by the digital platform. So if we're not helping and doing research across the board, like into our service delivery as well, like we could really miss the ball when it comes to building up a platform. So yeah, it's a tricky balance because if we're in product, we're beholden to product. That's where a lot of our resource is going and should go, but we also need to sort of like support other teams, not just to benefit them, but to benefit like as researchers, like our understanding of the business.
I think one thing we, not to lead the conversation too much, sorry Laura, but one thing we touched on yesterday was the idea of kind of upfront initial buy-in and then sort of continuous buy-in. And I think that's obviously, Mike and I are currently in the position of more continuous buy-in and broadening influence. And that's where, for us, it's really important at the moment, is that we demonstrate the value to other teams and the importance of research, because we know the value of research and what it can deliver for individuals and for teams in the business. So for us to sort of be able to provide examples of where we're doing that, again, show, don't tell, really helps. We believe will help drive the business forward and improve the impact that we make. So we're trying to sort of demonstrate that in lots of different ways, and of course being hands-on and helping people through those processes and democratizing research beyond the designers in the team, but to product managers, to people in the customer success team, sales teams, even people are asking who are speaking to our customer base. Like, it seems, I think everybody should know a bit of research, right? And everybody should know some of the techniques that researchers that employ and take advantage of. I think there's such incredible strengths if you've got them.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we can dig into that. Thank you. I mean, there are a few things in that, but like mostly around like demonstrating the value and the impact, and having like getting the more upstream you go, the more value potentially you can drive. But I think maybe one of the things that, especially when you're talking and looking for buy-in and having to kind of show don't tell, like what are you showing, like how are you measuring the value that you're driving, how are you pointing back to the conversation that we had to say that decision that we made or that advantage we gained in the market was because of that piece of that insight that we found? Or how are you showing the value that research is kind of bringing to the table?
Good question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can. Like, I think that, I think it's a bit of a, I know it sounds really, maybe there are ways, but I'll just speak from my experience of if you're very effective at collaborating within an organization, and you're not exclusive in your work, that you're not kind of running your work in a vacuum and kind of holding on to it, but you're really kind of trying to become as embedded as you can as a design community, it's very hard to point to the things you created exclusively. So, and you have to be really generous about, you cannot go around, holding on to things because you want to be able to kind of show them as a trophy at the end. And so it is a trade-off. And I think that an awful lot of value, if you're embedded and you're inside an organization, you can't be wanting to point to design trophies and say, well, we made that and we made that, because an awful lot of it is like, in the same way as engineers don't go around pointing at stuff that they made. And so, I mean, if you want to be collaborative, you have to be collaborative. You have to trust that your credibility and credentials come through being part of a process, not owning the process and not being exclusive. And it takes a bit of confidence to do that. And I think, again, back to this idea that if you're a small group of designers, that can feel really vulnerable. But if you're long enough in an organization and there's a bit of a legacy of design, you can let go of that anxiety. And I don't think you can point to something and say design only made that. I mean, I think, but I do think there's ways, when you think about research, I mean, pure research is not terribly useful, but the analysis of the research is where you start to show your kind of credibility, and then the quality of the insight that comes off the analysis. And so, showing someone research is just like reading a storybook to them. It's like, it can sound good for a while, but people walk away going, so what? Like, I need to know what I'm supposed to do. And so you have to do really, really good, very, very methodical analysis, and you have to show your analysis process. So you've got research, and then you've analyzed your research, and you need to be able to show the principles that you're using to analyze. And then you need to show from your analysis the key insights and the actions that can be taken with those insights. And I think when you start to show actionable, really robust things that can be taken, like actions that can be taken by an organization, is where your research starts to show its value. So research by itself is not going to ever be valued. I mean, it can never be understood enough to be valued by itself. It needs to become part of this process of analysis and insights and actions.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think like it's a very collaborative process, right? And the team should claim credit for, like, we're like, successful products are built by teams, right? And the team as a whole takes credit for building a successful product. So I think yes, we have a product update each month where each team sort of talks through the work they've been doing and what's working, what's not, sort of thing. And I've got a slot there to talk about research, and it's quite hard to put some slides together because, like, all of the product managers and stuff, they're threading in the research that they've been doing and the impact that's had on the product. So when it comes to me, I'm not reeling off a list of insights, and I shouldn't really be doing that anyway. It should be threaded into the team. They should be saying, like, we learned this, and this is the impact. Mm-hmm. This is the decision we made off the back of it. Like, that's what we're trying to aim for, really.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've got a great deal to add to that. I think the idea of kind of being reductionist and saying this specific thing that we heard here led to this decision is basically close to impossible, because there's so many different. I'm sure you could spend an awful lot of time going back through that, but it's probably not worth the value in doing that. Equally, I think it's very difficult to know, coming back to the point about risk mitigation, knowing what risks or what mistakes you've not made because of that. which kind of seems a bit crazy. So I think there are exercises that are useful in kind of understanding, where more research. Even today, when Mike and I were in a presentation, we were sort of questioning, like, well, how could research have played a bigger part in mitigating that mistake that was made, or the problem that was caused by this? So the idea that we kind of jump into research to solve that problem, I think is more interesting than going, how do we prove the research of it? But of course, Mike and I are quite biased and we're bought into that. So, but we can obviously see the value that research is delivering. But I think I agree with Lorna. It's like it's a very difficult thing to prove the value of, and something that we've been through a number of cycles of trying to prove the value of UX and measure success, and have that almost separated from the product success. We're all so intertwined, and we're all working towards the same goals that they shouldn't really be separated. I guess the challenge that you're trying, or the thing that you're trying to avoid there, is somebody coming in and going, yeah, but do we need research, or do we need design for this, or could actually just put an engineering team on that? I'd like to think you'd probably get some early warning signs about that sort of thing, so you can mitigate that early. But yeah.
Cool. I'm enjoying this discussion, but I'm also slightly conscious of time, and I want to make sure that we do get through like some of the questions that have come in today, but also kind of before this as well. And a lot of what I was seeing kind of ahead of the event was questions from designers around speaking the right language and kind of ROI, and kind of how you engage with different stakeholders in the right way. So I wonder if you could maybe speak to that. I don't know, maybe Mike, if you want to kind of talk first on that point.
Sure. So I guess like when you're new to a company, or when you're like talking to someone for the first time, maybe having like a coffee with someone in the leadership team, like I quite like asking them, what experience do you have with like design and research, to see where they're coming from, and then can you have you got an example of like research that you've found particularly valuable, or research that is not valuable, and you can quickly get a sense of the kind of things they care about. So like using that time with them to get understanding of the assumptions they're carrying with them from past roles, or past iterations in the business, and then just things that they think are interesting, how they value research. That's where I would start.
I can speak a little bit from, I've worked a lot on, again, in healthcare, and I think, industries that I think maybe service industries in particular, they're so human centric in terms of the behaviors. Like, product is, maybe more of a manufacturing. So there's insight up front in trying to find a universal design, or trying to find something that will work for as many people as possible, and is attractive and is compelling. But once you lock that in, it's a design, it's manufactured. And services are so dynamic, and they're being shaped by the behavior of the people that are delivering the service and the people who are receiving the service. And so I think design in the kind of service industry, service and systems, is a really interesting place where, because every day the service is naturally evolving, because people are turning up in a service context, and there's customers arriving into healthcare settings, and there's the providers, and that kind of, it's very, very organic. And so because of that, there's a lot more understanding about, you have to be really, really curious about your customer, because you haven't made a product that you're selling. You're basically trying to figure out every day, how do you exceed expectations, and how do you understand with your customer? And so I think design has moved into the service space. There's a lot more understanding, throughout the organizations, about why design is a lens on your customer. It's a mechanism to be paying attention and feeding. It's a feedback loop in the system. It's feeding back into your organization a level of awareness, and kind of just a kind of just being vigilant and aware of what's going on with your customer, which is different to marketing, who'll be running surveys over summer, and then product who's testing something. I mean, this service industries have really changed the landscape for design because it has made it very front and center, because it's very real time. And I think it's very different than working in product. I think we're quite lucky if you're working in a service industry.
Yeah, I agree. I think the come back to the question before and talking about how difficult it can be to actually get some sort of raw data about the impact of research on a process. I think continually demonstrating the value of research and providing that back to the business is really important, because the value of research kind of comes in snippets. As you were talking about earlier, Lorna, you'll look at something and kind of understand the value of an insight that's coming out or something, right? That constantly speaking with your user base is what's kind of important, and those sort of snippets of how people are feeling, the insight into that, you almost in some ways don't know who it's going to be most valuable to it sometimes. So I guess, like, from our perspective, I think what we try and do is share early and often, and constantly share small snippets of information as opposed to like long reports. How do you kind of get it in front of people so that they can start digesting and processing that information? It doesn't become this massively labor intensive process or a tab that's open that they never end up getting around to reading, right? So how do we kind of offer that insight to people as frequently as and digestibly as possible? And also, of course, being thinking about the audience, like, who does this research really matter to, and how do we share that in the most kind of efficient way, I guess.
Just building on that, I think, like, approaching how you play back research in like an experimental way is really useful. If you're doing a big workshop and playing research findings back to a team, make sure you get feedback in situ, so what's useful to them and what's not. And if you're posting insights out on Slack to particular people or to a particular group, like, just keep track of the kind of engagement they get and how often people are talking or referring back to those insights when they're building on a service or a product. I think, like, we need to approach that kind of effort in a lean, like, experimental way to see what really works within an organization, because every company is different. Every company has its own way of communicating, its own channels. So you can't necessarily like cookie cut from different companies. You've got to constantly be trying to evolve and learn how to best like impact or influence a business with research.
I think there's also something interesting, because Mike, you mentioned earlier about people kind of referencing, like, good research is kind of when someone says they learned something from you. I mean, that's often the kind of the evidence that someone has remembered it. That and I think insights that travel. Like, sometimes if you run a big workshop, and Tom, to your point, you can people can drink out of a fire hose, but there's probably like 3 things they're going to take away from it, right? So understanding that your research isn't about just showing, it's not a quantity, it's a quality thing. And so I've seen, you see this where people are, they're just kind of showing too much research because they love it, and we get such a kick out of going, and we could just spend hours talking about it, and people are just literally falling asleep, and they're like, and it's almost like we want to prove we've done it and prove how rigorous it was and prove how much we learned from it. And it's like someone showing you their code. I mean, how many want to sit through watching pages and pages of code from software guys? I mean, we would never tolerate it from them. So we need to think about the takeaway. Like, what's the most important thing from the research that you want people to walk away and tell someone else about? Like, how far can your insight travel? And I think you should work back from that. You should say, there's a couple of key things that are really important, that are very novel, and that are really unique, and that would actually, that really would contribute and are kind of like a kind of fresh lens on something. And they're the key things you want people to walk out of the room. Is not that they were able to say, oh my God, they did like hours and hours and hours of research. Those guys are really hardworking. We need to get past that and just think key takeaway, insights that travel, that turn up in different groups. I mean, to Mike's point, that someone next week is talking about something, even if they own it, they think that it was their idea. It doesn't matter. If your insight travels and it's contagious, that's a real indication that you're doing good work.
Yeah, completely. And kind of back to buy-in, I think that's really important to kind of understand people's appetite for insight. Like what is, you know, as designers and as researchers, one of the things I think our superpowers is empathizing with people and really kind of understanding them, and perhaps sort of over analyzing things sometimes, but really understanding, you know, what is it they want to know, and are their eyes going to start rolling? Are they going to start checking Slack halfway through this? Do I need to get to the point really quickly, or are they going to be really engaged with this? I think pitching at that right level is not only going to kind of improve things in the moment, but also going to build your credibility with them longer term, so they will listen. I think it's such an important thing to kind of get right.
Amazing. There is a question here in the chat of who or which department from your experience is usually the hardest to get buy-in from?
I think it can sometimes be that, like, the departments that are closest to the customer. So, you know, sales and customer success, you know, they have a much, like in a sort of like a B2B business, they have a much deeper relationship with the customer than we will. We're jumping in at specific times to ask, like, you know, having an in-depth conversation with those customers, but they've got an ongoing relationship. And so, you know, they feel, and a lot of the time it's rightly justified, that they know that customer better than we do. But like the way that we ask questions is quite different to how they would ask questions, and the kind of topics that we cover. So there's you know, it can be a challenge in some places to you know, start an initial like relationship with those teams, but like the you know, the value for both sides is really valuable, is really valuable, because like I mean, just for instance, you know, if you're talking to, you're lining up a customer to talk to, having a customer success or a sales manager talk you through about, you know, what they know about that customer before you go into that conversation, makes you much more prepared and ask much more valuable questions, and vice versa when you're coming out of those calls, like playing that back to the sales or customer success manager shows that you're delivering value to them. So yeah, that's like I think a way to sort of try and deliver value and get more access to those teams that I found works quite well.
I think it's a good one. I wouldn't say this is personal experience from Zencargo, but in general, I think the teams that maybe slightly, and I don't know whether it's necessarily teams or perhaps individuals, but those that are sort of idea-led and come up with big ideas that don't want them disproved and are scared of that. And I think personally, like, the empowering thing about research is that it can inspire new ideas and set you in the right direction. It shouldn't be something you should fear. It shouldn't be something you should actively get involved with, and do it as frequently, as early as possible, because it'll help course correct, and not, you know, those big ideas that you're building up in your head don't get, like, the short of the full, right? If you're coming up with an idea that's bad, you can do some research into it, you know that it's the wrong direction. That's a pretty cool superpower to be able to do that, and then point yourself in the right direction with good research is another great superpower.
I mean, I agree. I think, you know, Mike and Tom, I couldn't agree more with both your kind of reflections on that. I think also, just in general, I remember, you know, kind of trying, you know, bringing research in the tech industries, and there's a kind of sense that it would just slow us down. So I think there's people who have a process that they're really invested in, and it ultimately has worked because it has been, you know, what the market has wanted. So it's more of a kind of tech push rather than a user pull. And I think if they're really invested in their process and they feel like pausing to understand, you know, I think people feel like, well, you know, someone else owns the customer, or, you know, it's someone else's, and that comes back to kind of a lot around principles around ethics. Like, you think about the kind of ethical implications or consequence of some tech, and no one really knows who owns that. And so that's, you know, people think that that's a very, you know, is that the design community's responsibility to be kind of flagging and highlighting some of the consequence of some emerging tech, and no one knows who's accountable. But when you start to bring things that are complex and nuanced and almost philosophical, people think it's just going to slow the process down. So I think that sense of people in principle believe in it or respect the idea that there is a need to consider the impact, the human impact on a lot of industries, in terms of their kind of accountability and also environmental impact. I mean, to be frank, it's a great example. Everyone's a bit vague about who actually owns that, like who's really accountable. And so within a process, you feel like those things that are so nuanced slow your process down and so I think that anyone who's kind of locked into doing something that is kind of a way that they kind of work, and there's no on-ramp and off-ramp to go off and have these conversations, they see them as being very distracting. And it's not that they don't believe they need to happen, they just think they should be happening somewhere else. And so I think it's people who say, I get it, but it's not part of my process, you should take it somewhere else. So you're kind of shopping around your research, and everyone's like, well, it's great, but you should give it to Bob over there because Bob really cares. And they don't know where it fits. They just don't know where it's supposed to fit in the process. I think is where you kind of end up with, kind of hanging on to your research longer than you think you should.
Just building on the sort of it'll slow us down message, I think you get that a lot in research. Like we don't have the time to do research. I'm sure everyone's heard it here. And I think one thing to counter that is like there's nothing slower than moving fast in the wrong direction, right? And if we don't course correct with research early, then later down the line you're going to lose your best people as well, because good people want to build products that are meaningful, so if they're sort of winging it and we're just churning out features, you're going to lose them because you're not going to hit the mark as much as you would if you back your product up with good research and design.
I mean, I think it comes, I mean, if people are, I think if research is, good research can often be contrary, and that it can bring back, Tom, you made this point, it can bring back something that is contrary to what people believe. And I think, it's really hard. I mean, if research is validating, it's fine. People are very tolerant of that, and you can kind of validate things. But if it's challenging, and if it is calling into question existing decisions that are kind of the kind of corporate model of how people work does not know how to accommodate hard stops and sharp turns when people are on deadlines and budgets. Like it is so people will be like, I don't know what to do with that information, so I'm just going to ignore it. And it's not because they're bad people, and they're not because they're stupid. It's they don't have anywhere to put it. And so I think it's really, it's where in the process, we're in the corporate kind of process of developing a product or a service. Are you allowed to take the sharp turns and the pauses and the kind of, and who's good at making, really kind of tough decisions in real time? And I mean, people aren't even trained to do that typically, and they just expect someone else to do it, and somewhere else, like not in this team and not in this, so I think it is really challenging, and it's not just designers feel that challenging, everyone feels it as challenging.
I feel like we've just hit a topic that I'd want to go in for like another half an hour on. And like Mike's quote being like, there's nothing slower than going fast in the wrong direction. I mean, yeah, we've kind of hit something that I'd love to go in further on, but I am conscious of the time. I want to respect your time and everyone else that's joining us. So just to say kind of thank you to everyone that has joined. Thank you to the panel. Really enjoyed this discussion, and I think I was going to ask for any kind of final key takeaways and tips, but I think there's been so much in here already for people to take away and kind of implement, and really hope that people have got value from this. I've certainly enjoyed it. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day wherever you're joining from.